Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 126, Learning Occlumency. In that shabby little house on the sea, Harry had experienced the most magical night of his life. The next morning, he lay in bed as long as he could, reluctant to open his eyes, almost afraid that it had all been a dream. In that dream, a massive owl had delivered his acceptance letter to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Then a giant named Hagrid arrived, told him he was a wizard, and even used magic to punish Dudley, his bully of a cousin. He worried that if he woke up, he'd find himself back in the tiny cupboard under the stairs at home. If he could, he'd stay in this dream forever. But then Hagrid's voice broke through. "Up and at, Harry. Now's not the time for sleeping in." Harry rubbed his eyes, watching as Hagrid opened the window and released an owl that had just delivered a newspaper, which Hagrid bought for 5 nuts. "What's that?" Harry asked curiously. "The Daily Prophet, our wizarding newspaper," Hagrid explained as he stretched. "Wizards read it to stay informed." He added, "We'd better get going, Harry. We've got a full day ahead. Off to London to get your school supplies, and pick out 2 birthday presents." "Birthday presents?" Harry asked, surprised. "One for you and one for Kyle." Hagrid grinned. Strange coincidence, his birthday's today too. A birthday present? Harry's heart leapt with excitement. But then he remembered the name Hagrid had mentioned and asked, "Who's Kyle?" "He's another young wizard at Hogwarts, 1 year ahead of you," Hagrid replied, already pulling on his boots. "A good kid. Kind-hearted, friendly to everyone, and the professors and students all like him." Hagrid continued as they left the hut, making their way to the outer reef. "He's sharp too. The only student in 300 years to get a special award for services to the school in his first year. If all goes well, he'll likely be the youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin." Harry blinked, taking in all these impressive-sounding titles. Though he didn't recognize any of them, he could tell from Hagrid's tone that they meant Kyle had accomplished some incredible things. "If you ever need help or run into trouble at Hogwarts, you can go to him," Hagrid added. "He'll look out for you." As they walked, Harry muttered the name to himself, Kyle. Imagining what this other young wizard might be like. Not knowing any wizards, he naturally envisioned something from TV and mashed it together with Hagrid's appearance. In his mind's eye, Kyle was a serious-looking boy wearing a tall, pointed hat and a deep black, or maybe blue or red, cloak, clutching a thick wooden staff with a jeweled tip. And maybe he even had a dead ferret looped around his waist as some strange magical token. Achoo! Kyle, seated at breakfast in St. Catchpole Village, sneezed suddenly. "Dear, are you getting a cold?" Chris asked, looking concerned. "No, I just felt an itch in my nose," Kyle replied, rubbing his nose. He figured it must have been from all the owls he'd come into contact with recently. He had no idea who'd spread the word about his birthday, but as soon as daylight broke, a steady stream of owls began flying into his room, each carrying beautifully wrapped gifts. The deliveries nearly filled half his room with brightly colored boxes and ribbons. Just as Kyle was mulling this over, another owl swooped in through the open window, placing a large box on the table beside him. "It seems you're quite popular at school," Diana said with a smile. "Receiving so many gifts." "Mum, have you forgotten which house I'm in?" Kyle asked, reaching for a piece of bread. "Hufflepuffs are known for their connections." "Naturally, I have plenty of friends." Diana chuckled, saying nothing more. Kyle glanced at the newest package, which he recognized as coming from Lee Jordan. Judging by its shape, it was likely another cake. This seemed to be the most popular gift he'd received. There were already over a dozen cakes stacked in his room upstairs. Barring any unexpected surprises, these cakes would be his main source of food for the next few days, and he knew the Weasley kids would likely be sharing in them, especially Ginny, who would be thrilled. With a wry smile, Kyle shook his head and took another bite of sausage. After breakfast, Chris called Kyle aside. "We've given some thought to what you asked us yesterday," he began. Kyle's eyes lit up with anticipation. "You're going to teach me?" "Of course," Chris replied, nodding. "We have no reason to object. But, could you tell us why you're so determined to learn occlumency? It's no easy skill, after all. Even many adult wizards struggle with it, so for a young wizard like you, this is quite ambitious." Kyle hesitated briefly before answering, "Because of Orin. Back in the Forbidden Forest, I had the feeling he could read my thoughts. It felt invasive, and I don't want to experience that again." Though Orin was a convenient excuse, Kyle's reasons went far beyond him. Occlumency was the only known magic that could guard against external mental infiltration, an essential skill if he wanted to delve into the mystery of Horcruxes. He knew he would inevitably need to interact with enchanted objects like the diary and the diadem, both of which could pose serious risks without occlumency to shield his mind. With Voldemort's proficiency in soul magic, Kyle knew he would be dangerously exposed if he handled those Horcruxes unprotected. Kyle had attempted to teach himself occlumency last year, but, as Chris had pointed out, it was notoriously challenging. Trying to learn without guidance had been painstakingly slow. After half a year, he'd barely managed to reach the beginner's level. At this stage, he knew his skills were nowhere near strong enough to contend with the mental intrusion of a Horcrux. "Orin?" Chris repeated, grimacing at the name. For over a month, he had pondered the connection but could recall nothing apart from that rescue mission 10 years ago that might link him to Orin. After a sigh, Chris said, "If you're truly certain, we can make arrangements for your training." "I'm certain," Kyle affirmed eagerly. "When do we start?" "After work?" Chris shook his head, a mysterious smile forming. "No, you won't be learning from us. For occlumency, we've actually found the ideal teacher, and he's agreed to instruct you." "A teacher?" Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 127, My Teacher is Not Human. Kyle frowned slightly. To be honest, he wasn't exactly thrilled about someone else teaching him a branch of magic as personal as occlumency, especially if it involved exploring his mind and memories. He wouldn't want even Dumbledore involved in something that sensitive. In fact, most wizards felt the same way about occlumency, and Kyle was sure Chris understood that. But Chris's expression suggested he had great faith in this teacher. Kyle hesitated, not wanting to refuse outright. He decided he'd go see for himself first. If he didn't feel comfortable, he could always think of an excuse to bow out. After some discussion, Chris had initially suggested they wait until Kyle's birthday celebration, but Kyle felt otherwise. Birthdays came every year, and he was far more curious about the identity of this occlumency teacher. He wanted to confirm if this arrangement would work for him as soon as possible. Since Kyle was so eager, Chris agreed without hesitation. They headed to an open area outside the house, where Chris extended his arm. "We'll disapparate there. Just grab my arm." Taking a deep breath, Kyle clutched his father's outstretched arm. "Let's go." With a loud crack, they both vanished, reappearing moments later in front of a charming wooden cabin with a red roof. The cozy little house, impeccably neat and surrounded by a low fence, looked warm and inviting. Outside stood an elderly couple, smiling in greeting. "Grandpa Newt? Grandma Tina?" Kyle's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected Chris's teacher to be Newt and Tina Scamander. But if it was them, he could hardly ask for better. "Kyle, aren't you here to learn occlumency?" Tina Scamander said with a laugh, pinching his cheek gently. "What are you waiting for? Come on inside." Tina led him into the cozy house, showering him with biscuits and freshly baked buns. Though he'd just finished breakfast, he couldn't resist and managed to eat quite a bit more. Finally, feeling thoroughly full, Kyle rubbed his stomach and asked, "Grandma Tina, are you the one who'll be teaching me?" Of everyone here, Tina had the most advanced occlumency skills. Her younger sister Queenie was a natural legilimens, and if Tina hadn't developed strong occlumency, she'd have had no way to keep any secrets. But Tina only smiled and shook her head. "I'll help you with the foundational theory, but after that, it's out of my hands." "Not you?" Kyle looked confused, glancing over at Newt for clarification. "Not me either, kid," Newt said with a smile, placing an open crate on the ground. "Come with me. I'll show you who." Kyle's stomach tightened with apprehension as he eyed the crate. But Newt had already stepped inside, so Kyle followed. The crate was astonishingly large on the inside, resembling a vast ecosystem of trees, rivers, and lakes, a forest in its own right. They walked until they reached a clearing by a lake, where an elegant creature awaited them. Gracefully approaching was a wampus cat, its sleek form moving with the silent confidence of a predator. Its piercing blue eyes fixed on Newt and Kyle, and it lowered its head slightly in acknowledgement. "This is Natalie," Newt said, gently scratching the wampus cat under her chin. "Remember, Kyle, every wampus cat is a natural legilimens." "Of course. I remember," Kyle replied, though his enthusiasm was quickly turning into unease. Chris walked over, clapping Kyle on the shoulder with a grin. "So, what do you think? Pretty impressive teacher I found for you, right?" "So, my teacher really is the wampus cat, Natalie?" Kyle asked, eyebrows raised. "Exactly," Chris said. "If you want to master occlumency quickly, you'll need to feel enough pressure to trigger intense emotions. We discussed it and agreed that Natalie is best suited for the job, and she's already agreed." Chris continued, "Once you've learned the basics, we'll send you here. Natalie will try to break into your mind, and your job will be to keep her out and avoid getting hurt. If you can last 5 minutes, it'll mean your occlumency is strong enough." "Wait, 5 minutes?" Kyle looked incredulous. "This is a wampus cat. Even if I manage some level of occlumency, I'd still stand no chance against her." The wampus cat was a 6-legged magical creature renowned for its speed. To be blunt, if Natalie wanted to best him, she wouldn't even need legilimency. It was practically overkill. "Don't worry," Newt said, his voice calm. "Natalie's smart. She knows what to do." "But..." Kyle began, but he was cut off as Natalie stepped forward, rubbing her face against his cheek with a gentle purr. "Meow." "Of course I trust you," Kyle said, scratching her under the chin. "I just think this method might be a bit intense." "On the contrary," Chris said, his tone serious. "If we were to teach you, we'd need to use legilimency to challenge you as well, just like Natalie. But unlike us, Natalie can practice with you anytime. And she won't spill any secrets from your head." Kyle paused, realizing Chris had a point. Being subjected to legilimency was unnerving, but if it was Natalie, it somehow felt a bit more bearable. "Okay, I agree," Kyle said, nodding. Natalie purred approvingly, then lifted her front paw and gave him a swift, surprisingly firm kick right on the backside. Whoosh! Without a moment to react, Kyle was launched into the air, spinning as he went, before splashing down into the lake nearby. Chris and Newt, momentarily taken aback, quickly exchanged a knowing look. "Looks like she's already set on starting his training," Newt chuckled. "I'll be heading over to check on Anair. She recently had a litter of nifflers and could use some help recovering." "And I'll go with you," Chris replied, shaking his head in amusement. "I'm off today anyway." Newt nodded, and they began walking toward another section of the sanctuary. But after a few steps, Chris turned back and shouted, "Remember, no charms allowed." A single hand rose from the lake, waving in reluctant acknowledgement. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 128, Newt, Danger. No one knew better than Kyle what it was like to face an adult wampus cat without a wand or any other form of magic. He had been in Dorset for a week now, and apart from eating and sleeping, he spent nearly every moment getting thoroughly pummeled by Natalie. The wampus cat's piercing blue eyes could see directly into Kyle's thoughts. No matter how he tried to hide, her paw would appear right in front of him, softly if he managed to block her legilimency, or with enough force to send him flying if he failed. If she saw only blurs in his mind, he'd get a gentle tap, but if his mind was an open book, she'd mercilessly knock him into the lake. The first few days, Kyle took more dives than he cared to count, his clothes perpetually soaked. But gradually, as he focused and improved, the incidents lessened, and after a week, when Natalie's paw struck him, it was light enough that he only stumbled before regaining his footing. "Very good, Kyle," Tina called encouragingly from the sidelines. She held a small niffler in her arms, her tone firm. "Keep your mind free of those wandering thoughts. Don't think about what's coming next, just stay in the moment." Unlike Chris and Newt, who mostly left him to his own devices, Tina visited regularly. When she sensed Kyle's focus wavering or his anxiety rising, she'd offer him gentle reminders. Hearing her now, Kyle turned and gave her a thumbs up. Natalie, watching him from across the clearing, tilted her head, surprised. It seemed she hadn't seen his reaction, otherwise, she'd have given him a sharp tap for letting his guard down. Tina raised an eyebrow, noticing this subtle change. Later, when she returned to the house, she found Newt working over a bubbling cauldron. "I think you can go ahead and write to Chris," she said with a slight smile. "So soon?" Newt looked up, clearly surprised. "It's only been a week. Has he already managed to resist Natalie's legilimency?" "More or less," Tina replied, setting the little niffler down. "Natalie's no longer as relaxed as she was at the start, she's moving faster now, and I'd say she's mostly reacting by instinct rather than using legilimency. Neither Kyle nor Natalie has noticed it yet, but I believe he's made enough progress." Wampus cats were, after all, magical creatures with highly refined instincts. Even if Natalie was no longer using legilimency directly, her body was conditioned to behave as if she were, following vague impressions rather than specific thoughts. Dumbledore was right. "Kyle's a remarkably talented boy," Newt remarked, standing and dusting off his robes. "I thought he'd need at least a couple of weeks. I'll write to Chris and ask him to come pick Kyle up." Tina thought for a moment, then said, "Wait, are Chris and Diana planning anything over the next few days?" Newt paused, considering. "I don't think so. Chris mentioned he'd take Kyle shopping in Diagon Alley for his school supplies before term starts." "Well then, there's no rush," Tina said, smiling slightly. "Let's let him stay a few extra days. It's been ages since I've seen him." Newt scratched his head, puzzled. "Didn't you just tell me to write the letter?" Tina only shot him a knowing look. Newt chuckled, relenting. "All right, whatever you say." He returned to his cauldron, adding a pinch of white powder to the mix. The liquid shifted to a light yellow, and wisps of pink smoke wafted out, filling the air with a sweet scent. The little niffler, who had been surreptitiously stuffing a silver spoon into his pocket, froze, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His eyes fixed on the cauldron, and he licked his lips, looking utterly captivated. The niffler glanced around, then waddled over to a nearby shelf, angling himself for a leap toward the cauldron. With a small hop, he launched himself forward. But before he could reach the pot, Newt caught him midair. "Not so fast. Patience, now," Newt scolded gently, giving the niffler a soft pat. "And no hiding that spoon. Hand it over." The niffler tried to cover his pockets with his front paws, attempting a quick getaway on his remaining 3 legs. "Oh no, you don't," Newt said, holding the niffler by his hind legs and giving his belly a gentle scratch. With a defeated jingling sound, several objects tumbled from the niffler's pocket: the silver spoon, 3 nuts, a button, and a small whistle. Newt blinked, chuckling in amusement at the pile of trinkets. He wasn't quite sure when or where the little creature had managed to squirrel all those things away. At dinner, Kyle dragged himself out of the box, visibly exhausted. Tina handed him a towel. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. "Not so great," Kyle admitted, wiping his face. "Honestly, I don't feel any improvement from yesterday." "That's perfectly normal," Tina replied with a warm smile. "Occlumency can't be rushed. You've been at it non-stop for a week, it's a good idea to take a break. Kyle nodded in agreement. After days of relentless training, a change of pace sounded refreshing. How about baking cookies with me tomorrow? Tina suggested. We'll start with that in the morning and practice occlumency in the afternoon. Sure, Kyle agreed readily. Although he'd rather explore the other magical creatures in Newt's sanctuary, baking cookies was a welcome distraction, as long as it didn't involve Natalie's watchful eyes. At that moment, Newt wandered over. Do you think we could make them grapefruit-flavored? He asked. Of course, Tina replied, a bit taken aback. She hadn't expected Newt to remember her grapefruit-flavored cookies from when they first moved to Dorset. Thanks, Newt said as he washed his hands and sat down at the table, reaching for a slice of bread. I remember Anair loved grapefruit. Silence fell over the room. Tina's smile vanished instantly. Oh, right. She said in an uncharacteristically flat tone, setting down her spoon. I just remembered, we're out of grapefruit. Butter cookies it is. Newt blinked, confused. But didn't you just say, crunch? Tina snapped the spoon in her hand, her expression severe. Let me be clear, she said sharply. We don't have any grapefruit. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 129, The Suitcase and the Niffler. In the days that followed, Kyle's routine shifted. At Tina's suggestion, he began spending mornings baking cookies and bread with her. Sometimes he even helped Newt care for the other magical creatures in the sanctuary. In the afternoons, he continued his occlumency training with Natalie, the Wampus cat, though progress was still frustratingly slow. It felt as if he was perpetually just short of a breakthrough. Another week passed, and when Kyle arrived at the clearing by the lake, he was surprised not to see Natalie waiting for him. Am I early? He muttered. No, your training is complete, Tina said, walking over with Newt, who was carrying a bucket of apples, and the Wampus cat at their side. In fact, Natalie hasn't been able to read your thoughts for a few days now, Newt explained. Her recent attacks were purely instinctual. Kyle frowned. Instinctual? Newt nodded. If you don't believe me, let's test it. He pulled 2 apples from the bucket, one large and one small. Choose an apple. Together. Natalie glanced at Kyle, and both pointed to the larger apple. Kyle turned his head, puzzled, as Newt's face turned slightly pink. Ahem. Just a coincidence, he mumbled, dumping the remaining apples onto the ground. Let's try it a few more times. The Wampus cat looked at Kyle again, and this time, they chose different apples. The same thing happened in subsequent attempts. Satisfied, Newt pocketed his wand and returned the apples to the bucket. Now do you believe me? Yes, Kyle nodded, convinced. If Natalie had still been able to read his mind, they'd have picked the same apple each time. As they headed back to the house, Kyle asked, Did you know I'd completed occlumency for a while? For about a week, Tina replied. Wondering why we didn't tell you? Kyle nodded, curious. At first, we wanted to be absolutely sure, Tina explained. But as the days went on, I realized you were managing well. Besides. She chuckled, a twinkle in her eye. You've always performed so well, it was a bit fun watching you look a little lost now and then. Kyle's mouth twitched as he glanced at Tina, who, despite her 90 years, still seemed to have a mischievous side. What kind of sense of humor is that? But, regardless, learning occlumency was a worthwhile achievement. Kyle stayed with the Scamanders for another 3 days, finally departing a week before the start of the school year. Newt didn't write to Chris about his return, instead, he personally saw Kyle off. Just before he left, Newt handed him a small box. Your birthday present, Newt said, handing Kyle the box. I'd prepared it earlier, but since you were busy learning occlumency, I had to wait until now. Hope it's not too late. Kyle took the box eagerly. It was slightly smaller than Newt's own well-traveled suitcase, but it was modern and freshly crafted, clearly made recently. The space inside isn't enormous, but it should be just right for you, Newt said with a smile. Make good use of it, and don't go putting any magical creatures in there, alright? I'd rather not hear you got expelled from Hogwarts one day. Kyle grinned, knowing Newt's own Hogwarts career had ended abruptly over someone else's crime. Once Newt left, Kyle hurried home, carrying the box with anticipation. With Chris and Diana both out, the house felt empty. He went straight to his room, set the suitcase on the floor, opened it, and jumped inside. The space below was indeed small, a cozy room with only a basic shelf. But outside the room was a vast, open meadow, nearly as large as 2 Quidditch pitches, with a tranquil lake in the middle. Though smaller than Newt's sprawling menagerie, the area felt huge to Kyle. At 12, still a student at Hogwarts, this was more than enough for his needs. He wandered around, mentally mapping out spots for various projects and creatures. This area's good. Once I learn the atmospheric charm, I could make a rocky den here for moon calves. I'll put Devil's Snare nearby. Close to the lake would be perfect for the chomping cabbage, he mused. For simpler plants like Dibney, I'll set up a spot near the moon calves, easy access. And those trees over there, perfect for bowtruckles. They'll love it. Walking along, Kyle eventually reached the lake. He hesitated slightly as he looked into the sparkling water but quickly reminded himself there was no wampus cat here to toss him in. He looked down into the clear depths, spotting a few lionfish drifting lazily near the bottom. Just as he was about to move on, he felt a small poking sensation at his shirt pocket. Startled, he looked down to see a tiny creature the size of his palm. It had soft black fur, a small, flat nose resembling a duck's bill, but otherwise looked like a miniature mole. Niffler. Kyle whispered in surprise. He hadn't expected another gift hidden in the box. The tiny Niffler, clearly very young, clung to his robe with its tiny paws, fiercely gripping a gold galleon that it was trying to stash in its pocket. Kyle watched, amused, as the Niffler attempted to complete its heist, slowly managing to tuck the galleon into its pocket. But just as the coin was nearly hidden, Kyle gently plucked it out, lifting the determined little creature along with it. The Niffler clung to the galleon, its little paws gripping it as tightly as it could even as Kyle gave it a gentle shake. "How did you end up here?" Kyle asked, amused. Since Newt hadn't mentioned the Niffler as part of the gift, it was likely this little one had snuck in on its own. The Niffler, still clinging to the galleon, tilted its head as if it hadn't understood a word. Then, undeterred, it tried to stuff the coin into its pocket once again, managing the feat with a kind of mini pull-up. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 130, The Weasley Brothers' Interrogation. Nifflers have an innate love for anything that glitters. From the moment they're born, they seem to spend every waking hour either searching for treasure or preparing to do so. They're rarely ever still. The young Niffler in front of Kyle was barely a month old, just slightly larger than a galleon, and had likely snuck into his trunk when Newt wasn't looking. Kyle had already noticed, during his time in Dorset, that Newt spent hours each day tracking down runaway Nifflers. If anyone else had been in Newt's shoes, Kyle thought they would have given up long ago. But having only one Niffler around shouldn't be a problem. To ease Newt's worry, Kyle quickly wrote a note explaining the stowaway, handed it to Ratton, and watched as the owl flew out of the window with the letter. "This communication system is so inconvenient," Kyle muttered, scratching his chin thoughtfully. While the wizarding world had its charms, communication methods felt downright primitive. A single letter, even with an owl, took at least half a day for round-trip delivery, nothing like the instant convenience of a phone call. He knew Newt wouldn't have minded using Muggle devices, but the Scamanders lived too remotely, nearly in the mountains and surrounded by Muggle-repelling charms. Installing a phone or answering machine there was unlikely. After seeing Ratton off, Kyle placed the Niffler back in his trunk, then took a quick shower and changed into fresh clothes. It was worth noting that the clothes Chris had sent him in Dorset were from last year. Kyle had grown so much this year that he could barely fit into them, so Tina had made a few adjustments to make them wearable, at least for now. Not long afterward, the Weasley twins arrived. As soon as Kyle opened the door, Fred and George barreled in like bandits. "We saw your owl flying off and figured you'd finally returned," Fred announced, draping an arm around Kyle's shoulders with a mock-serious expression. "I can't believe you vanished for half a month without a word," George added, blocking Kyle on the other side. "Even worse, we didn't get a single letter from you the whole time. Do you have any idea how worried we were?" Fred added, turning up the dramatics. Kyle, however, wasn't buying it. "Worried about me? I'd expect that line to work only on Ron." "Really now, because if I remember correctly, neither of you has written to me in over half a month, either." Kyle raised an eyebrow, looking between them. "Are you sure this is about worrying over me?" The twins exchanged a panicked glance, their serious facades crumbling almost instantly. "You didn't write to Kyle?" Fred whispered to George. "No, I thought you did." "Well, so did I." In truth, the twins had known about Kyle's trip to Dorset from the day he'd left. Chris had told them himself, so they weren't worried in the least. They'd only concocted this line to give Kyle a hard time, hoping to mess with him a bit. Unfortunately, their carefully crafted plan, put together the night before, had fallen apart almost immediately. Their excuse, about sending letters with Errol, was weak at best. They'd been so absorbed in skiving snackbox research that they hadn't even thought about writing to Kyle. "Ahem. Of course we were worried about you," Fred stammered, sounding anything but convincing. "But you know, Errol's getting pretty old, and we just couldn't bear to make him fly that far with a letter." "Fly that far?" Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you knew exactly where I was." The twins' faces grew even more awkward. "Just a guess." "You know, an educated guess," Fred said, trying to salvage the moment. "But now that we see you're fine, we're quite relieved." "Is that so?" Kyle drawled with a skeptical look. "You're quite the fortune tellers, then. Maybe you two should sign up for divination this semester, you'd be the stars of the class." With his narrowed eyes and slow drawl, he looked just one greasy lock of hair away from a certain potions professor. We'll think about it," George said sheepishly, eager to change the subject. "By the way, we've got good news. Over the past couple of weeks, we not only wrapped up the Fat Tongue toffee but also developed a second product for the skiving snack box." He pulled a small, orange fruit jelly from his pocket. It was translucent, looking almost like a shiny pea. Fred winked at Kyle. "Care to guess what it does?" Kyle took the jelly and inspected it. Unlike the Fat Tongue toffee, this piece had no detectable potion smell, suggesting that the twins had perfected its creation. "Taking a wild guess," he said, "does it make people's noses bleed?" Fred and George's faces lit up simultaneously. "Nosebleeds!" Fred exclaimed, eyes wide with excitement. "Kyle, that's brilliant. Why didn't we think of that?" George slapped himself on the forehead in a dramatic show of frustration. "A nosebleed, what a perfect excuse to skip out of class." "Kyle, you're a genius." Kyle grinned. "Thanks. It's nice to know my brilliance is appreciated." "Too bad school's starting soon," Fred sighed, looking deflated. "We won't get a chance to test it out this year." "Maybe over Christmas break," George suggested wistfully. "Or next summer." Watching them lament as if they'd just lost 100 galleons, Kyle chuckled, holding up the gummy. "Alright, so what does this one actually do?" "It's a puking pastille," George explained, shrugging. "Makes you throw up. Handy, right? But this one's still a prototype," Fred added. "We're working on a quick antidote. Vomiting non-stop doesn't quite do the trick." "Do you need any help?" Kyle asked. "Not this time," Fred replied, shaking his head. "The main ingredient in the puking pastille is diluted sneezewort juice. Combine it with rue and daisy root, and you have a perfect counter, and we're close to nailing it." Kyle nodded in understanding. Sneezewort and rue were a classic pairing, ideal for antidote making. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.